Hey, it's working. Okay, we're now recorded. So, yeah, this is something that I've done for a long time. I'm happy to answer questions anytime if people have problems, questions, or just want an overview. Hey, hit me up on Slack. I'd happy to set up a meeting. So, I put together this agenda. I didn't really put a whole lot into it other than I have gone ahead and updated the direction page for the requirements management category. Hopefully, that is helpful to people. I am working also on a slide deck that I have sort of started. I admit it's in its infancy. I'd be happy to share that and kind of walk through things at a top level if people want me to, or if you want me to jump into questions, that's great too. Whatever makes the most sense for you guys or everyone. I'm sorry. So let's just kind of burn through this. I got some questions here. Would you like to verbalize your first question? I can go ahead.
Yeah,
What is it?
sorry.
Oh, no.
Sorry, I didn't catch. My name is pronounced Janpa.
Okay.
It's so yeah. My question, you probably answered it at the beginning of the call. I was wondering what is the time frame or estimation of having this minimum viable component being done, or when we plan to when we plan to start on this and when we plan to have something done. What are your expectations or estimations?
So I've gotten a lot of different expectations from a lot of different people, to be perfectly honest. There was a large push to ask if we could get anything in 12.5, and I said I didn't think we were quite ready for it in 12.5. I think they're going to want to see some progress in 12.6. But to be honest, before this is viable, it actually requires a decent amount of work. So I'm hoping we're going to sort of kick this off in 12.6 with some good progress and iterate on that probably for a couple of releases until we have something that's really usable by the vast majority of people. So I'm thinking the next 4 months, I would like to see the MVC be at a place where we're viable for outside use at an actual scaled implementation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, cool, thanks.
Absolutely.
So how this feature will work? So I read what is requirements management, aerospace use cases. So how we will integrate this into GitLab?
It's a very good question. Thank you. The biggest challenge of this is requirements at their core are a set of behaviors. And in regulated industries, and even non-regulated industries, people are more and more asking for requirement management because they want to be able to define behaviors for their product and then trace their implementation and their verification or testing to those set of behaviors. So currently, and this is not set in stone, the concept would be to have a whole new sort of primitive called a requirement. It would either be open or archived. It would have an identification of some sort of a unique number or text, doesn't really matter. It just has to be unique so people can link to it. And it would have basically object text or requirement text. How this is implemented, I am very open. I don't want to drive implementation details. At the end, these need to be able to link to one another, and they need to be able to link to source code, test results, tests, and all that sort of thing. So whatever makes the most sense from an implementation perspective, I'm fine with, as long as there's an interface to it that's usable. As we progress, I'm guessing one of the things that most companies or most products like this are sorely lacking and people really want is a visualization of this tree of requirements. That would be something that would be awesome if we could provide because nobody does it well right now. The other thing nobody does well right now is integrate requirement management into versioning systems. The biggest players in the industry right now are IBM Rational Doors and Atlassian's Jira or Jama implementation. Jama is slightly better than Doors. Doors is awful for integration. It doesn't integrate with anybody. So you basically have to create these dummy modules in Doors for all of your test case names and for all of your file names, and then link to those, and those represent what's managed in your version control system. So if you rename something over in your version control system, you'd have to then go back and rename it in Doors, and it's a very manual process, and everybody hates it. We're very uniquely positioned that everything is self-contained within GitLab, which is awesome. So that's sort of where we want to take it long term. Short term, what we're really looking to do is enable people to put textual requirements in GitLab and decompose them within the requirements sort of area. And then as we move forward, that will allow them to link to other requirements. And then from there, we'll expand out to link with issues, expand out to link to test procedures, which are files, test results, which would be files. Some of this plays heavily into the idea of artifact retention and artifact curation. I know there's another team working that as well, where, for instance, when you run your CI/CD testing, right now it says pass or fail, and that's saved, but it doesn't save off the results implicitly into a file in the version control system. And that's something that they're working toward, and those are the results we would end up tracing these requirements to, because those are the test files or the result files that prove we implemented our requirement correctly. So that's another place we'd end up adding a link down the road. Does that help?
Yeah, that makes very sense. So how do we, how the software will be, in this case it's GitLab, how the GitLab will know the requirements are met? So basically, is there a way to that these requirements depends on these specs, these tests, or let's say my software doesn't have any specs,
right?
So but in this case, so how can the software know that the requirements are met?
That's a very good question. In general, it's all done via traceability, and traceability is effectively this linking we're talking about. So if you get a customer spec at a high level and you decompose that down into a bunch of requirements, and then you trace those to issues where you implement the code, and you trace those to code files, you trace those to test procedures and test results. In an ideal world, those passing test results would be linked from that requirement, and we could roll that up and say, okay, this traced to 5 tests, those 5 tests are passing, therefore this requirement is covered in passing. In a more regulated industry, what they'd end up doing is they'd review those 5 test cases to verify they fully cover the requirement, and therefore when they pass, you have now a reviewed and validated, effectively, the trace, such that when those 5 test cases pass, you are now claiming compliance to that requirement. In a less regulated industry, it's probably good enough to say, hey, we wrote 3 or 4 tests, they're all passing now, so we can rest assured that we have some coverage of this requirement, and that's good enough for what we're doing. How far you take this depends on your industry. As a brief sort of sample, in aerospace, every line of code must be executed. You must prove that. You also must prove that every decision statement is covered in all the decision forms. So if you have an if statement, you have to verify that the true and the false path are hit. As you nest these, they get incredibly complex and horrible, and you have to verify that every path is taken. And you have to verify that every line of code traces to some requirement somewhere, which traces to some other requirement, which satisfies the customer. So that's the extreme. We're not looking to market to the extreme anytime in the near future. We're looking more for companies who, let's say they wanted to do an app and they have the GDPR compliance, they want to verify that they're GDPR compliant. They can write tests currently to do that, and they can say to their customers, yeah, we meet the GDPR. It's a much more powerful statement if they say, hey, we define some requirements around it. We have tests that trace to those. Those tests are passing on this build, so we still have done GDPR compliance to the best of our understanding. If they get it wrong and somebody comes after them and go, hey, look, we put tests together. Yeah, we're wrong. We'll fix it. We'll update it, and here's what we update. But it's a much more powerful statement to say that you have actually thought through, decomposed, and tested to those. And it shows a message to your customer that you really do care and you really have a plan in place to cover this stuff, not just some guy somewhere in my testing department says we're good kind of thing. Excellent. Okay, I think the next question is, our requirement is supposed to be group scoped. Again, that was done to create a more minimum viable change, is to keep them within a group. In the ideal world, how this would generally work at a large scale is you'd have different groups for different things. So your customer spec would probably be its own group, which would have its own requirements. The software team would have their own group, which would have their source code and their requirements, their high-level requirements, and you would trace from the high-level requirements of the source code group to the system group, which would have the system-level requirements. So in the end, we will need to be able to cross groups with this stuff. Somebody had mentioned it was much simpler to keep them group scoped to start with, and I'm totally fine with that as an MVC. If that makes architectural changes that are more complicated to do later, I am perfectly open to doing it a different way.
I just added a comment. I think that we kind of run into this with epics after the fact, where it would have made more sense if we had project level epics that behaved slightly differently, but were on the project level that rolled up to the group level. And I think since right now code lives in a project on a repository, you're going to have both. And it's similar, like you're going to want to have a group level requirement that then is decomposed into a smaller requirement, maybe at the project level where the
Yep.
implementation is going to happen, right? So, and then where the implementation happens is where you have the tests that satisfy the requirement, and all that's going to live on a project, or it will span multiple projects in a lot of organizations, especially those that have like a services oriented architecture. But you almost need the both levels, and I would say like we should assume to plan for both of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I had the same feeling when reading the proposal, so I just wasn't sure because group was mentioned in the text, but in diagram also project was mentioned. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
So overall, we do need to be able to do both. It's just we don't need to start off with both. And I think my point, there's probably a happy medium there. Again, whatever makes the most sense. I am not familiar with the implementation, so I don't want to drive anything implementation wise, the details. Last question from John. I'm not sure if he's here or not. Given the impracticality of having licenses for competitor software, how do you suggest people get acquainted with this stuff? That's a very good question. Doors licenses run in the tens of thousands, and I think JAMA is similar. So you're right, it's very impractical. I don't know the best way to go about that. I've used both. I am very happy to host as many sessions like this as we need, and answer questions. I am also trying to put together a slide deck, and I can share that here if you'd like. It's very immature, where I kind of walk through what is a requirement, what is a good requirement, what is a bad requirement, how are these generally organized, how does this all play together, just so that people can kind of get a feel for it. Effectively, in a regulated industry such as aerospace, the tools in general are really bad. The tools thus far are basically Doors and JAMA, as I mentioned, and both of them are external tools that people have tried to sort of duct tape into a requirements management system. Am I breaking up for everybody, or is it just my connection's weird on my end?
For everybody.
Hopefully. Okay, let me try to turn off my video and see if that helps. Is that any better?
Yeah.
Excellent. We'll go with that for a bit and see what happens. Okay, Gabe, would you like to vocalize your first question?
Sure. How are requirements going to interact with issues? Attaching them to issues and that sort of thing. I know that I saw a comment somewhere of, well, we should have discussions on requirements, and I kind of want to understand like how the relationship between the two is going to work moving forward.
In my world, I don't see requirements and issues tracing to one another. I think issues are used to create the requirements. You write an issue to add requirements. You write an issue to add implementation of requirements. But the issue is an implementation construct, and a requirement is a totally different construct. A requirement is more a durable. Okay, I may be back online. I'm not sure. Sorry about that. Okay, I think I'm back. I don't know what's going on with the internet today. Can people hear me?
Cool. I think we just got the first part of it, which is you said they're completely different constructs, requirements and issues.
Yeah, to me, an issue is what you'd create to create requirements. You'd create requirements under an issue, but you don't really trace them together other than this issue is used to create these requirements, because requirements are a durable construct that last for the duration of a project, basically. Issues are intended to make changes to that project. You write an issue to change something. So in general, how this is done in industry that I've worked in and in industries I've seen is you would write an issue to say, decompose the following requirements. That work would be done under that issue. Those requirements would be updated, decomposed into smaller requirements. You then write an issue to implement those requirements. That's when the implementation would take place. You then write an issue to verify those requirements. And that's when you develop test procedures, test cases, and you do the verification. The issues kind of go along, and that's how you modify these artifacts. So our requirements are considered artifacts. Your your code is an artifact. Your tests are artifacts. Your results are artifacts. Issues modify artifacts in general. So you'd schedule all this work in issues and epics to do the work, but the artifacts remain throughout the course of the project development cycle. That makes sense.
Correct. Yeah, it does. I think that means there's still just like there's a proposal out there to make tasks a first class object on an issue, right? Which would only live on an issue, but in this case, requirements would live somewhere else, which makes sense. But they're still going to have to be treated differently. So like if you have if the issue is the mechanism to change a requirement or decompose a requirement, you're going to have to associate the current version of that requirement. If it's a change, then say like what you're proposing, how the requirement would change. And then once that issue is approved or closed or move forward, like there would almost be like a process that you would have to then mutate or change or update that requirement. But based on traceability, you would probably still want to know where that change was initiated, and that's still like where you're going to have to associate issues to requirements.
You will, because they will be the change drivers to those requirements. You're absolutely right.
Correct. Yeah. And the other thing that I was kind of thinking about, given the fact that these are longer term things, it's almost like some form of version control. Seems like it would make sense, and I don't know if you can build requirements like on top of Git themselves, which would make sense. It seems like it would.
That would be a awesome implementation, because currently what both JAMA and Doors do is once you've developed all your requirements, you then have to snap a baseline manually by going in and creating a baseline, and that baseline has to get checked into your version control system to formalize it as an artifact. You cannot use the requirements in the current working state in Doors or JAMA, from my understanding, as your baseline, because there's no change or change control on those things. So building change control in from the get-go, just like you'd submit a merge request under an issue to add to the requirements, would be huge. So if we could do requirements in a text-based file structure, that would be awesome, because then we're linking files to files, which is what we're going to end up doing down the road when we link requirements to code files, requirements to test results. That's all linking to files. Having requirements themselves be a tree of files with the ID being the file name, for instance, and the requirement text being in the file is an opportunity. I am very open to that implementation. I don't want to drive implementation per se, but yes, long-term, we would like to be able to version control the requirements themselves.
Yeah. I think it would be helpful to, I would update the strategy page to kind of outline, like in a perfect world, right now, if like here are all the things, like here's the end state, right? So that way we can work backwards and identify the constraints that we need to solve for to get there and make the right technical decisions now. Because I've seen like a lot of times when we just do this MVC thing without that, we end up making small incremental changes, which is great, but then we sacrifice long-term like architecture decisions that we have to now go back and fix. That's painful.
You're absolutely correct. That's one of my biggest risks with this right now is if we take this and we do an MVC and then we find out, oh, we need to add version control into requirements. And we're like, well, we did it all in a database. There's no way to do that. Now we've got to change the architecture. I don't want to release something, get people excited about it, get them using it, and then basically pull the rug out from under them and say, oh yeah, and by the way, we have to restructure the whole thing, we have to re-architect it. That would be not good.
Yeah, I don't disagree with the initial MVC. I just think that all those considerations should be like, if you know in the future it's going to have to do this and do these various things, then let's go ahead and say that now, not that we're going to implement it, but then we can work backwards from there and kind of make sure the MVC, the smallest thing, adheres to the kind of long-term goals.
I'll go ahead and update the strategy page for that. That's a very good suggestion. Thank you.
The other thing that I was going to ask, and this is the next question, is like how do requirements text, how is it going to be tested and verified? So if you have a text or string that's a piece of text, how is that going to be mapped to tests and verification in a technical sense?
You generally will manually link your tests to the requirement that they cover. So a test procedure may cover, well, if we use aerospace terms, a test case is itself a requirement in a very loose term. So you write a test case that says this is what the test is going to do, and you trace that to the requirements it covers. You then write test procedures, which are the actual tests themselves that trace to that test case, and then you have the test results, which are the result of the test procedures running. And those test results trace through the procedures, through the cases, up to your requirement. So you're not necessarily auto-linking this stuff. It's usually done by hand, and the links have to be reviewed by a competent engineer in order to claim they are truly reviewed test requirements, basically. So I guess to me, there's uplinks and downlinks, or inlinks and outlinks, depends how you want to look at it. There will be test cases that trace up to a requirement at the implementation level. And that's generally how that is handled, if that makes sense. Does that answer the question, or is there?
Yeah, no, one of the reasons why I brought that up is it seems like it could be an opportunity here to kind of automate things a little bit. So I don't know if you're familiar with like the Gherkin syntax and writing BDD tests, but it's more or less like you write a requirement and a testable requirement in human readable language that makes sense, and then you can easily associate your steps to that step through the code base, and then that's how you can link the two things together. And it seems like, moving forward, like that, doing something like that, I don't know if we use something off the shelf, if there's something better than Gherkin that allows us to do that, but designing the requirements text from the start to also say like, this is how we're going to link the two, and our goal is to make it not manual,
Right. And that'll work fine for non-regulated industries. For regulated industry, unless those tools are qualified, they can't be used, which is why they don't use any of that stuff, because to tool qual something like that is incredibly expensive and next to impossible, because it's like there's a lot of undefined states and it was not designed to be qualified. So for an unregulated industry, yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great opportunity for a lot of people. And I think that's who we want to appeal to in a large degree as well. So I think it's a great opportunity. I will say that from a regulated industry, you won't see them use that. They will manually do it.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Or we can figure out what it means to get qualified or whatever, certified.
You have to have requirements for the tool, and you have to test those requirements.
Well, maybe we could do it for ourselves.
We could tool qual. I mean, there's no reason you can't do a tool qual. The difficulty with tool qual comes that for aerospace right now, it's DO 178C specifies how you do a tool qual. For automotive, it's a completely different standard. For system level requirements, it's a third standard. So you end up qualing the same thing like 6 times just to meet and check the box for every standard, which becomes like unwieldy.
Right?
What's that?
There's industry specific qualifications.
That's exactly it.
So we almost have to pick industry vertical that we really would want to serve, and then push on that, and then see where there's overlap elsewhere. Yeah.
It would be excellent to offer through professional services where they could contract us to qual a part of our tool as part to work in their process as an added fee. We did that all the time. Like we contacted Ada Multi, who's a giant compiler vendor, and said, hey, we need a qualified compiler. Because if you don't have a qualified compiler, you have to now test at the object code level, which is next to impossible. And we worked with them to create a qual package for their compiler, and we paid them for that. We do that. That's a very common thing where you can provide as an option a qual pack that is optional to the product itself. So it's a nice add-on thing.
Makes sense. The other question, which I haven't written yet, is I know when I talked to one of the aerospace companies, bigger ones that uses GitLab right now, they also use Doors, I think.
Yep.
There's a presentation I can find somewhere if you haven't seen it yet, or like the recorded video. But what they do is they do all the requirements in GitLab, and then they go and they write them all up in some sort of visual diagram type tool. Maybe it was Doors, but it kind of visualizes all of the requirements and how they link together in a kind of diagrammy type way. And I think that could also be a cool thing instead of just having like static, nested lists, but to make it a little bit more modern and interactive. And I also know that we're working on somewhere in the company, making Git support really complex, large files, like static files, so that you can version control diagrams and stuff like that.
Version control MATLAB?
Yeah. which that could be a cool thing too. But I just wanted to throw that
Yeah,
out there.
absolutely. I mean, if I, having dealt with this for 18 years in a horrible state, if I had my way, I would love to be able to right click on a requirement, say visualize requirement, or show me the ancestors in um, at the top and bottom, and have it view a tree where you could click through and see this stuff. And then you could click through and double click on it and it opens the test file that you just clicked on, or you click on the code file and it opens the code file. That would be an unprecedented step forward for most of these people, because it's all very manual right now and it's very time consuming and very costly. And for people to have that ability to be able to actually click through the requirement trace in that manner would be awesome.
Have you heard of Cypress? It's I guess, end-to-end testing framework for JavaScript.
I have.
I'll put this in here. Idea. Like add videos to the requirements. So what this does is when tests run in CI, it records a video, and then it will attach that video to like the test run. So that way anybody can go and say like, here's the test, like here's the feature we wrote, here's the test that passed, and here's the video that you can watch showing the actual product do the things that we're testing against to verify that it's working correctly. And when it passes or when it fails or whatever, which that's like I noticed a lot of people who are using that rave about that, especially as the engineers are able to then say like, hey manager, you want to know it's done, here's a video, like,
right,
peace out.
No, that's an excellent point. I mean, being able to tie that stuff together, that I know artifact collection is something we're working through currently, but what type of artifacts we collect is really powerful as well. Being able to collect something like a video illustrating a product doing something is a far more powerful thing than saying, here's a wall of text, go read it and you'll see that it passes.
Yeah, I think that's also the intent too behind putting quality management and requirements in the same group, so that you can like work on both sides of the spectrum and kind of help them meet in the middle. But that's my only like general feedback at the beginning, is just like think about end state, decompose that into like, what's the smallest thing that we can do to move that forward, but making sure that we're making the right architectural decisions.
Do people want me to set up like a weekly office hours type thing for this as we move forward for the next couple of weeks as we evolve this idea, or how do people want to proceed forward with this?
As a PM, not responsible for this.
Feel free, load me up.
I mean, like it's the other way around of what do you need to be successful and what can we provide you. I think the engineers maybe might have a different take on it because they're making the implementation decisions. But like, I'm happy to participate if that's helpful to you. But at the end of the day, like it's your.
Agree. I would like to make sure that I want to put the bigger picture. I think that's great feedback. I really appreciate that. Get more of the bigger picture vision on that page. I know we're supposed to call them category strategy pages. So long-term strategy, what do we think it'll be in a year? Think big, get something out there, and then I'd love to make sure that there's feedback on that, because I want to make sure that I'm not driving implementation. That's very important to me. I want to make sure that we're leaving it open-ended enough that people can be creative and come up with great ideas that solve these problems. That's the key point.
Cool.
So I'll go ahead and make that update. I'll send that out to the same people that are on this call right now. Sorry, this ran a little bit long, and I will get this video posted out to the YouTube Unfiltered when I can figure out how to do that.
Good job, Mark. This is really exciting for me personally, and I think you're doing a great job kind of getting wrangled and getting things going in a very not clear space at the moment. So kudos.
No, thank you. It's a fun problem to solve. I'm enjoying it. Great. Well, I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you.
Bye.